If you can chat and be a good companion, you can drink yourself into practice. Fortunately, George Cheney was a good companion, and in no time he was hobnobbing in London's more fashionable clubs and taverns, where it seems he gravitated toward a certain caliber of gentleman. I found the bottle companions, the younger gentry, and free livers to be the most easy of access, and most quickly susceptible of friendship and acquaintance, nothing being necessary for the purpose but to be able to eat lustily and swallow down much liquor. He was quite apt at both, and while he grew daily in bulk and in friendship, his practice grew as well, and soon he found himself working all day and then staying up late into the night, drinking and eating and making new friends. He was living the London high life, but soon he found himself to be growing excessively fat, short-breathed, lethargic, and listless. And in 1705, after only 3 years of living in London, George Cheney, who had never been a slight man, found himself at 32 stone, or 450 pounds. And after a series of vertiginous paroxysms, which by his description sounds like mild heart attacks or even strokes, he had a complete collapse in his health. So, being a doctor and using his scientific mind, he decided that he was going to find a way to solve his current predicament. And the first part of his solution was to get out of London. He moved to the country and began to pore over the latest studies and theories about how food and health are related. And in his studies, he met a Dr. Taylor from Croydon, who by living on milk only cured himself of an otherwise incurable distemper, the epilepsy, and lived in perfect health for 16 years after, till an accident cut him off. And so Dr. Cheney went on a crash diet of milk, seeds, bread, mealy roots, and fruit. And in a matter of 6 months, he claims that he lost 250 pounds and felt lank, fleet, and nimble. So he returned to London, and those who knew him were in awe of this miracle diet. And so he became a bit of a celebrity, but he reverted to his old lifestyle, and in a few years had gained most of the weight back, and his health was even worse than before. So he concluded 2 things. London was not for him, and it was time to get back on the diet. He moved his family to Bath and rededicated himself to the diet, though in a less strict version, and he wrote an essay on health and long life, and it became a bestseller. Granted, some of his case studies were a little bit suspect, like one man who he claims lived to be 169 years old, and another named Parr died at the age of 152 years, 9 months. His diet was old cheese, milk, coarse bread, small beer, and whey, and he might have lived a good while longer if he had not changed his diet and air. Supposedly, the 152-year-old man moved to London and began drinking expensive wine, and that is what killed him. And this is when we really have to remember that as earnest as George Cheney was in solving his problem, he was still practicing medicine in 18th century Britain, a time when bloodletting and leeches were still in their heyday, something made clear when Cheney lists the maladies that could be cured with his milk, seed, and vegetable diet. Habitual gouts, confirmed cancers, obstinate venereal distempers, the stone in the kidneys or in the bladder, the epilepsy, elephantitis and leprosy, a humorous asthma, a chronic diabetes, an incurable scrofula, and a deep scurvy. I love that he includes a little adjective with each affliction. And my favorite is the humorous asthma, because humorous in the 18th century was not used in this way to mean funny. It meant that it was controlled by the humors, or the medical idea that there were 4 fluids in your body that controlled everything about you, both mental and physical. And the humor that he believed was affected by meat, wine, and ale was the blood. The grand secret and solo mean of long life is to keep the blood and juices in a due state of thinness and fluidity, whereby they may be able to make the rounds in circulations with the fewest rubs and least resistance that may be. But regardless of some of his reasoning being off, his new and improved diet did seem to work, especially because as the years went on, he realized that it wasn't a one-size-fit-all kind of thing, and so he would change it slightly based on each patient, sometimes even including some wine and meat. And his patients were some of the cream of English society: the philosopher David Hume, the poet Alexander Pope, future Prime Minister George Grenville, Samuel Johnson of dictionary fame, and the founder of Methodism, Reverend John Wesley. And it makes sense that these were the people who suffered from what he called the English malady, as nervous disorders are the disease of the wealthy, the voluptuous, and the lazy, and are mostly produced and always aggravated and increased by luxury and intemperance. Well, I don't think John Wesley would ever be considered luxurious or intemperate, but even so. Now, the good doctor was not beloved by all. He had his detractors, mostly other doctors. Sour grapes? Perhaps. But as we've seen, Cheney's methods were not above scrutiny. I mean, one thing that he prescribed for some people to do was to stick their finger down their throat to produce gentle vomits each morning, or else swallow tobacco to have the same effect. But it was not the purging that the other doctors scoffed at, but rather his insistence on eating vegetables and getting 8 hours of sleep each night. See, Cheney believed that it was unnatural to be awake late into the evening, even though it was something that he had done in his younger years. The reason being that you were susceptible to the noxious damps and vapors that were produced in the evening hours. So one should be in bed by 10 p.m. and should be up by 6 a.m. in order to take advantage of the fresh, benign morning air, that cheerfulness and alacrity that is felt by the approach presence of that glorious luminary, the sun, which adds a new force to the heart and a spur to the spirits. Now, the other part of his diet that was absolutely crucial was his insistence on daily exercise, though nothing too strenuous. Certainly, riding on horseback is the best of all. Next to that is riding in a chaise or chariot. He says that these were good exercises because it allowed for all of your internal organs to move up and down in unison. Makes sense. Next to these are the active games and sports, such as hunting, shooting, bowls, billiards, shuttlecock, and the like. But the exercise should only be physical, never mental. Study of difficult and intricate matters will infallibly do hurt. Reading must be light, entertaining, and diverting. Conversation must be easy and agreeable without disputes or contradiction. Now, while most of his theories and writings are a little outdated, the last section in his very last work, called The English Malady, it still speaks so much truth today. He calls it the author's own case at large, and it's a sort of memoir of his weight loss and health journey. And he starts by talking about when he first lost that 250 pounds and then regained it, and subsequently spent his entire life losing and regaining weight in different amounts. And he talks about how difficult it is to stay on any diet, especially when it is a very restrictive diet. The most famous diet doctor of Georgian England, who is telling the other great luminaries of his time how to live a healthy life, and yet he struggled to live up to his own standard. It's interesting to see this person gain and lose weight, because I have struggled with my weight since I was a kid. And so this really, really resonated with me. I have gained and lost hundreds of pounds throughout my life. And so it's just so interesting to hear his story from 300 years ago and think, gosh, nothing's changed. And while he battled with this all of his life, he did live to the respectable age of 72. And in his last years, he wrote that he had kind of found a middle way of eating. My regimen at present is milk with tea, coffee, bread and butter, mild cheese, salad, fruits, and seeds of all kinds, with tender roots as potatoes, turnips, carrots, dressed or not as I like it. And I'm curious if I'm going to enjoy this milk dressed as milk soup. And here we are, milk soup the Dutch way. So I have to say, I kind of imagined that it would be white when I first read milk soup, but then the fact that you're adding in cinnamon and brown sugar, obviously it's going to make it a little bit darker. Often it's made now with white sugar and no cinnamon, so it is still white, but this is not. But it smells actually really good. Here we go. That is so good. Do you like Cinnamon Toast Crunch? Do you like the milk that is left after you finish Cinnamon Toast Crunch? Because that is what this is, only slightly thicker. There is not enough egg yolk in there to make it like thick, so it is still, it's only slightly thicker than the milk, but the flavor is that of Cinnamon Toast Crunch. I mean, it even has toast in it, I guess. Which, by the way, this sippet I'm going to take and see. See, it holds together. It's not soggy, but it is soft. I'm gonna take a bite. It's Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Like I said, it would not fit into any diet today and probably would not be what he thought of as a diet food either. Technically, it doesn't break any of his rules because he didn't really talk about sugar. Regardless of whether or not it's a diet food, you should definitely try it. It's really, really easy to make and just super delicious. But it's a dessert. Keep that in mind. So a happy new year to all. Make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. I'm actually going to finish this entire thing, but doled out over the next few days. Temperance. When the tomb of King Tutankhamun was opened 100 years ago, among the gold and jewels, there was a stash of food for Tut to munch on in the afterlife. So using the ingredients he had available in his tomb, I'm making a roast duck with a sauce of figs and dates. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we do our best to feed King Tut. This time on Tasting History. 100 years ago, in November of 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter, under the patronage of George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, rediscovered the tomb of the New Kingdom pharaoh Tutankhamun, better known as King Tut. 5 years they had been searching for this tomb, and Carnarvon finally told Carter, you know what, I'm calling it off, but Carter convinced him to give him one more season of funding, because he knew one place in the Valley of the Kings where they hadn't yet searched. It was the spot where they had been setting up camp for the past 5 years. Has anyone searched, like, exactly where we're standing? Nobody? Oh, this could be really embarrassing. And just a few days after they began to dig, they came across the first step leading down to Tut's tomb. So Carter called Carnarvon, who was home in England, and said, get back over here to Egypt and bring as many of the world's press as possible. And by late November, the world was ready to witness the opening of the tomb. The thing is, Carter didn't actually know if anything was in the tomb, because most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been plundered thousands of years earlier. So it could have very easily been a Geraldo at Al Capone's vault situation.
Good night, I'm sorry.
But they cleared away the rubble and were able to peer in, Carter with a candle looking into the room and Carnarvon behind him trying to see. Later on, Carter would write, at first I could see nothing. The hot air escaping the chamber caused the candle flame to flicker. But presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. For the moment, an eternity it must have seemed to others standing by, I was struck dumb with amazement. And when Lord Carnarvon, unable to stand the suspense any longer, inquired anxiously, "Can you see anything?" It was all I could do to get out the words, "Yes. Wonderful things." And there were wonderful things. Golden beds, a disassembled chariot, chests filled with bows and arrows, jewelry, scepters, statues, and boxes filled with items the pharaoh might need in the afterlife, including a box of fresh underwear, because even in the field of reeds, you always want to be prepared. There was also a sofa in the shape of a speckled cow, beneath which were 48 boxes containing mummified meats, including choice cuts of beef from the bone, gazelle, veal, ducks, geese, pigeon, and other small birds, the boxes often being shaped like the food within. The meat had been cooked and then went through a mummification process similar to the one that the pharaoh's mummy in the room next door had gone through. A months-long process of drying with an expensive salt called natron, then wrapped in bandages and covered in precious resins brought from hundreds of miles away in what is now Syria. These foods had to keep forever because they were meant for the pharaoh to enjoy in his afterlife. And it wasn't just meats, but other non-mummified foods. Jars that once held honey and wine. The wine jars being stamped with the location of the vineyard where it was made, the vintner who made it, and the year of the pharaoh's reign in which the wine was made. Very similar to how wine is labeled today. There were over 100 woven baskets that held the remains of dates, figs, pomegranates, melons, grapes, green onions, garlic, and bread. And if Tut ever decided to take up baking as a hobby in the afterlife, they even left baskets of wheat and barley. All the necessary ingredients to make an excellent meal, just like those that are delivered to your door from today's sponsor, HelloFresh. But I promise you, with HelloFresh, the food is always fresh and never mummified. That is a guarantee. With HelloFresh, everything is not only delivered fresh to your door, but pre-portioned, so the prep process is much quicker. And at this time of year, quick is very important. I'm super busy making extra videos for the holidays, and other people are busy attending holiday parties. And if you're throwing a holiday gathering, you can rely on HelloFresh for some homemade charcuterie boards and desserts. HelloFresh Market allows you plenty of flexibility to create something perfect, and ensures that everything you need will be on hand so you don't end up going to the grocery store 5 times in one day because you keep forgetting ingredients. I speak from personal experience. Last night, I made mushu pork bowls. They had a sweet and zesty sauce with just enough spice to give it a nice punch. Scrumptious and filling. So to give HelloFresh a try, go to HelloFresh.com and use my code TASTINGHISTORY60 for 60% off plus free shipping. That's 60% off using my code TASTINGHISTORY60 at HelloFresh.com. Now, unlike HelloFresh, the ancient Egyptians did not leave us any easy-to-follow recipes. They really didn't leave us any recipes. There are depictions of them cooking left on tomb walls, but nothing that tells us exactly how they made their food. So to prepare a meal for King Tut to enjoy in the afterlife, I'm going to rely on the ingredients that would have been available to him in his tomb, along with some educated guesswork. So with that in mind, we're going to make a roast duck with fig and date sauce. And for that, what you'll need is 1 duck, about 5 pounds or 2 kilograms, a few stalks of fresh herbs. I'm using marjoram and dill, which were both available in ancient Egypt. 5 cloves of garlic chopped into large pieces, some green onion chopped into large pieces, plenty of salt, and about 1/4 cup of honey. For the sauce, you'll need 1 to 2 tablespoons of olive oil, 1 cup of minced green onion, 1.5 cups or 350 milliliters of red wine, 2 tablespoons of red wine vinegar, 15 figs preserved in honey. You can use fresh figs as well, but the ones preserved in honey are fantastic, and you want to cut them into fairly small pieces. You also want to cut up 15 dates. And they need to be pitted, and the ones actually found in King Tut's tomb were pitted for him because he's a pharaoh and he don't have time to pit his own dates. So when it comes to actually cooking the duck, the ancient Egyptians had a few different methods. Most popular were either boiling or roasting over an open fire. Unfortunately, I don't have an open fire here in my kitchen other than the little one on the stove, and I don't think that's gonna go very well, so I'm going to roast it in the oven. So remove the giblets and trim the skin of the neck. Making sure the duck is nice and dry, score the skin of the breast with about 3/4 of an inch between each cut. You're going to do this in a crosshatch or diamond pattern, and you want to make sure that they are very shallow cuts. You're trying to cut the fat, but don't want to cut into the meat. Then cut a few more slits in the under part of the duck wherever it's fatty. Rub a couple teaspoons of sea salt inside the cavity of the duck and another heaping tablespoon on the outside. You want to get all over, but really focus on the breast, making sure that salt gets in those slits. Then stuff the herbs, onions, and garlic into the cavity. This is just for flavoring. You're not actually going to eat the stuffing, so just stuff it in there however you want. Then tuck the extra skin in and truss the legs, tying them together with a bit of kitchen twine. Then if the wingtips are sticking out, you want to cut those off, or you can just tuck them in under the duck so they don't burn. Also, you want this duck nice and dry if you want a crispy skin. You can just pat it dry, but it's better to leave it in the fridge for 8 to 12 hours. And yes, I know the ancient Egyptians didn't have refrigerators, but 1, they were in a desert, and 2, Tut's duck has been sitting there for 3,000 years, so you can bet it's very, very dry. Now once you're ready to cook the duck, line the bottom of a roasting pan with some crumpled up aluminum foil that will catch the fat and keep it from burning. Then lightly oil the rack and place the duck on it, breast side up. Then set it in the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit or 220 Celsius, let it cook for 15 minutes, and then lower the temperature to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius. Let it cook for another 15 minutes, then take the duck out and flip it over so its back is up, and then return it to the oven for another 15 to 20 minutes. Then remove it again, flip it breast side up once more, and this time you're going to baste it with the honey. It also helps if the honey has been slightly warmed, it just makes it easier to baste. Then you're going to return it to the oven and let it cook for another 10 to 20 minutes, maybe basting it one more time, you don't need to. The length that it's going to be in the oven at this point really depends on the size of the duck, your oven, and how you like your duck cooked. You want the breast meat to be around 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 55 Celsius, though some people do like it cooked a little bit more. Now, if you look online, it will often say that it should be 165 degrees.
False.
That should apply only to the dark meat. The breast meat should be much lower. If you get it up to 165 degrees, it'll be dry and kind of taste like liver. Now, while the duck cooks, you can go ahead and prepare your sauce. So heat the olive oil in a saucepan and then add the green onions and cook for about 5 minutes over high heat. Then pour in the wine and bring it to a simmer, then lower the heat to medium and let it cook for about 5 minutes, and then add in the vinegar, salt, dates, and figs. Then let it cook until it reduces by about half. It should take 10 to 15 minutes. Now, King Tut is perhaps the most famous pharaoh from ancient Egypt, but it's not because of what he did, but rather what was found in his tomb. And what most people know about Tutankhamun begins and ends with his tomb. So let's take a look not at the death of Tut, but at the life of Tut. Tutankhaten was born around the year 1341 BC during the 18th dynasty. And your ears did not deceive you, I did say Tutankhaten, which likely means living image of Aten. Only later would he change his name to Tutankhamun, and that was in an effort to rebel against his parents, just like teenagers today. And it was probably to rebel against his parents because we don't 100% know who his parents were. Basically, everything about Tut's life is up for some debate. But most scholars agree that his father was the pharaoh Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. Now, Akhenaten had a very famous queen, Nefertiti, though Nefertiti was probably not Tut's mom. Rather, his mother was another queen who is simply known as the Younger Lady. Might be Nefertiti, but probably not. What is known is that Akhenaten and the Younger Lady were brother and sister. Now, the reason that his father, Akhenaten, named his son Tutankhaten was because Akhenaten was the pharaoh that turned Egypt away from polytheism to focus more on one god, Aten. Aten was not the sun god, but he is represented by the disk of the sun. And in the promotion of Aten, the worshipping of all other gods was forbidden, their temples being abandoned and their priests being put out of their jobs. But it didn't seem that anyone was really a fan of this new religion except for Akhenaten. But he was pharaoh, so everybody kind of had to follow along. Spoiler alert, Akhenaten died, and everyone was like, well, let's not do that anymore. And so his son decided to change his name to Tutankhamun, or living image of Amun. Amun being one of the supreme gods and a lot more popular than Aten. Now, after Akhenaten died, there may have been one or two short-lived pharaohs, probably older relatives, before Tutankhamun came to the throne in his own right. And to make it more confusing, he did so under yet another name, which honored the sun god Ra. The boy had a lot of names, which is why it's just easier to call him King Tut. He also took a queen named Anksunamun. Same name as the lady from the Mummy, but not the same lady. Now, Anksunamun was the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, making her his half-sister. Very Targaryen. Now, in addition to the new queen and a name change, Tut also decided to roll back all of the reforms that his father had put in place. He moved the capital back to Thebes and brought back the old religion, which included enriching the priestly orders and restoring old monuments and temples. But it's not very likely that he was doing this alone, seeing as when he came to the throne, he was 8. The one likely at the helm was one of his most powerful viziers, a man named Ay. Now, other than the dismantling of everything that his father did and returning to the old religion, there's not a lot known about Tutankhamun's reign. His reign only lasted for 9 years before he died still a teenager. And there are romantic stories about him being murdered and lots of palace intrigue, but in reality, it was probably a much more mundane death stemming from a whole host of physical ailments because everybody was related to everybody else. Generations of swimming in a rather shallow gene pool left Tut with a clubbed foot, necrotic bones, and severe scoliosis. He walked with a cane, several of which were found in his tomb, and he may have had to have been strapped to his chariot. He was also sickly and had multiple strains of malaria. The kid made the Habsburgs look well-bred. So while we don't know exactly what killed him, there is no lack of contenders. And the reason that we don't know how he died or that much about his parentage or his reign is because after he was gone, there was an effort to wipe him away from the history books. See, after he died, Ai, who was the power behind the throne, became pharaoh himself. But after he died, Horemheb became pharaoh. Horemheb had been a general under Tut and Ai, and I'm guessing he didn't really like his bosses because when they died and he became pharaoh, he made an effort to wipe everything that had to do with them and, more importantly, with Tut's father, Akhenaten, out of the history books. The goal was to pretend that the Amarna period, that time of worshipping Aten and the years following, had never even happened. And he did a very good job. While their names were not completely forgotten, most of Tut's reign was lost to history, and we would know even less had his tomb been subject to the same ravages and robberies that many of the tombs of more famous pharaohs had in the past. Now, Tut's tomb was robbed at least twice in antiquity, but they were very, very soon after he was entombed, and it doesn't seem that they really got past that first room. And as his name was wiped from history, so was his tomb, because not long after it was built, another tomb was built nearby, and the debris from its construction buried the entrance to Tut's tomb. Even workers' houses were built over the entrance, and so it disappeared for millennia. It wasn't until 1922, only a decade after another Egyptologist said, "I fear the Valley of the Tombs is exhausted," that Howard Carter peered into the tomb and saw wonderful things. Like this roast duck with fig and date sauce, or at least the ingredients to make it. So once the sauce is thickened a bit, take it off the heat. It'll continue to thicken as it cools, but it's not going to get as thick as something that has been thickened with cornstarch. So if you want it that thick, add cornstarch. As for the duck, once it's ready, let it sit for 10 minutes and then go ahead and serve. And here we are, roast duck with a fig and date sauce, as might have been eaten by King Tutankhamun. And here we go. That's fantastic. So I love duck. Not everybody does, but I really love duck. Even when it's a little more cooked than I typically like. Sometimes timing things is very hard, and it will go from medium rare to a little more well done. It's not well done, but a little more well done very, very quickly because it will keep cooking even after you take it out of the oven. But it's not dry. It's more done than I like, but it's not dry yet. Flavor is just fantastic. What's really lovely is that sauce. It kind of reminds me of cranberry sauce in that it's smooth and yet it has like pieces of the fruit in there. The wine, there is no alcohol flavor to this at all. It's kind of all cooked off, so you're just getting the rich flavor of it without any burn from any alcohol at all. You wouldn't even know that wine was actually the main ingredient here. I do think as it gets colder, just like cranberry sauce, as it gets colder, it's going to start to firm up even more and more, and maybe that's a good thing. I think this could be eaten cold. It doesn't need to be eaten hot. In fact, they probably would have eaten it cold. Now, for those of you who have stuck around here to the end, I'm going to share with you a picture of when I played Lord Carnarvon in a play back in my 20s about King Tut when I first moved to New York. So, everyone should make this because I think everyone would, even if you don't like duck, make the sauce. Put it on a different bird or something else because the sauce is just wonderful. It's sweet, yet it's more complex than a cranberry sauce. It's not as sweet as a cranberry sauce because it's not filled with sugar. And the fruits are different than something that we're used to. It's actually perfect for Thanksgiving or Christmas, which are coming up. Anyway, I'm going to finish this. I'm probably going to move on to a leg, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
What a pathetic... Oh, he got what I tell you though. He...
Are you Team Pemmican or Pemmicant? Well, if you've ever considered setting out on a year-long journey across the Canadian wilderness, then you better be the former, so you can make this dried meat treat called pemmican. So thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video as we make one of North America's oldest dishes, pemmican. This time on Tasting History. So this has to be one of the most requested dishes that I've done here on the channel. Basically, ever since I did that video on hardtack, people have been asking me to make the meaty version of a survival food that has a shelf life measured not in months, but in decades, just like hardtack. And just like its cracker-like cousin, pemmican is less of an Epicurean delight and more of just a means to an end. It's not something that you're going to be serving at your next dinner party, but something that you'll be really glad you have when you are trekking through the Arctic. The word pemmican is derived from the Cree word for processed fat. Now, while it's the Cree word that is typically used today, pemmican was and still is made today by Native American tribes all over North America under many different names and with slight variations to the preparation. But at its core, pemmican is meat of any kind, dried and pounded and saturated with fat. There is as much nourishment in 1 pound of pemmican as in 4 pounds of ordinary meat. And that meat can be pretty much anything. There are old descriptions that talk about pemmican made of venison, beaver, elk, duck, rabbit, and even fish. Though perhaps the most common version, or at least the most well-documented version, was made of buffalo. And that's the kind that Lewis and Clark had as they journeyed across the plains searching for a passage to the Pacific. Some hunters were sent out to kill buffalo in order to make pemmican to take with us. Pemmington is buffalo meat, dried or baked, pounded, and mixed with grease. We eat an immensity of meat. It requires 4 deer, an elk and a deer, or 1 buffalo to supply us plentifully 24 hours. Meat now forms our food principally, as we reserve our flour, parched meal, and corn as much as possible for the Rocky Mountains, which we are shortly to enter, and where, from the Indian account, game is not very abundant. So even if they couldn't agree on a spelling of the word pemmican, I have decided to follow their lead and make my pemmican out of buffalo. And let's take just a moment and talk about that word, buffalo.
That is not a buffalo, it is a bison.
And yes, that is correct. The American buffalo is not, in fact, a buffalo, which is an entirely different genus with the rather whimsical name Bubalina or Bubalus. Oh, look at these bubalas. But most people in the last 300 years have not made that distinction and have called the bison buffalo, hence the Buffalo Nickel, Buffalo Bill, and many North American cities called Buffalo. So I know it is actually called a bison. Heck, the scientific name is bison bison. And the plains bison has the scientific name bison bison bison. It really wants you to know I am a bison. But as most writings from the period I'm going to be discussing call it a buffalo, I will be using the term interchangeably throughout this video. And if you want to blame somebody for calling it a buffalo, go ahead and blame the French, because it was French fur trappers in the 1600s who first called bison buffalo, the word being related to the French term for beef, or boeuf, something that you can learn when studying French with today's sponsor, Babbel. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world, and one thing that I love about them is their short 10-minute lessons. It allows me to squeeze in a lesson here and there throughout the day, and they're all taught by actual language teachers rather than put together by some AI. And since they teach real-world conversations, they're perfect for things like travel, and that's why I am actually brushing up on my high school French, because I'm hoping to plan a trip to France in the next year or so, and I could use a little help getting my feet wet again. I'll use phrases like je veux voir la tapisserie, because I really want to go see the Bayeux Tapestry. And because French people speak really fast, I'm sure I'll need to say, pouvez-vous parler plus lentement? Though to help my ear get used to hearing a lot of French, they have wonderful podcasts and videos to get you accustomed. Babbel has a few different subscriptions to choose from, including a lifetime subscription. So, If you're interested in learning a new language, it is the perfect opportunity. Just click my link in the description to get 60% off of Babbel today. And let me know which language you want to learn in the comments, and what kind of meat you're going to use. Whether you're using bison, buffalo, or some other meat, you need about 2 pounds or 1 kilogram of it. And you want to make sure to trim off as much fat as possible. So if you are using a fatty meat like beef, get the leanest cut that you possibly can. Then slice it very thin and preferably against the grain, which will make it easier to break up later on. But if you don't do it against the grain, not a huge deal. Also, to make it easier to slice very thinly, if you don't have a deli slicer at home, you can actually put it in the freezer for about 30 minutes. You don't want it frozen, but it will firm up and it just makes it a lot easier to slice thinly. Then lay the strips out on a wire rack and put them into the oven at the lowest temperature that your oven will do. Mine was 170 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 77 degrees Celsius, and that seems to be the standard. Also, make sure to put a pan in the very bottom of the oven because no matter how lean your meat is, it will drip a little bit of fat, and 1, it stinks if it falls onto the bottom of the oven, and 2, it's really, really hard to clean. Now, of course, this would not have been done in an oven originally. The Curiosities of Food from 1859 said, "The North American Indians dried their venison by exposing thin slices to the heat of the sun on a stage under which a small fire is kept, more for the purpose of driving away the flies than for promoting exsication. And then they pound it between 2 stones on a bison hide." A more industrial method of drying it was developed in the 19th century by Sir John Richardson, a naval surgeon and Arctic explorer. Richardson was from Scotland, so naturally he saw a similarity between the drying of beef and the malting of barley used in the production of whiskey. So he took steaks of beef that were dried in a malt kiln over an oak fire until its moisture was entirely dissipated. It was then ground in a malt mill when it resembled finely grated meat. And so to be able to grind it up, you're going to need to get it a lot drier than just beef jerky. You're looking to actually have it snap when you try to bend it. For me, that took about 10 hours in the oven. Also, if you are going to do this in a food dehydrator, that's fine, but put it into the oven at 200 degrees first for about 30 minutes just to kill all of the bacteria. Now, I dried all of my meat and I actually kept a bit back because I wanted to try it here on camera, just the dried meat. But I wrapped it up, and today my cat took it and ate it himself. This bad kid. So you just have to trust me when I say that the texture was that of very thin balsa wood, and the flavor was that of the mere memory of beef. I'm kind of certain that any flavor was all in my head. Anyway, once it is completely dried, you have to grind it up. I started with a mortar and pestle just so I could prove to myself that it could be done by hand, and once I had done so, I moved on and used a blender because it is just so much easier. Either way, you want to get it into a coarse powder. Now, the only other ingredient that you absolutely need for this is fat. The fat, which is generally the suet of the bison, is added by the traders who purchase it separately from the natives. So like I said, the meat and the fat are actually the only 2 ingredients that you must have for the pemmican. But according to Sir John Richardson, to render it more agreeable to the unaccustomed palate, a proportion of the best Zante currants was added to part of it, and part of it was sweetened with sugar. So you can add in some sugar or Zante currants or really any kind of dried berry. The earliest descriptions that I could find called for either Saskatoon berries or chokeberries, and even though Saskatoon is much cooler sounding, I couldn't find them. So instead, I was able to get chokeberries. And they look a lot like currants or any kind of small dried raisin, but the flavor is not the same. They're not that sweet. They're not bad. They're just kind of, they're astringent. Like I really could use some water right now. Definitely on the more sour side. It's not sour per se, but it's not sweet either. Regardless of what berry you use, if you use any berry, you'll want them chopped up very fine or ground into as close a powder as you can. The only other ingredient that I could find in any historical recipes was salt, and that really didn't show up until like the early 20th century, but I am guessing that it would help with the shelf life as well as probably the flavor. So to put everything together, mix the meat with all of the other dried ingredients while you melt the fat over a low heat. Now, different 19th century recipes have different amounts of fat. Sometimes it's a 1-to-1 ratio, same weight of fat to the same weight of dried meat, and sometimes it's a little bit less fat. So I would go ahead and have the same amount weight-wise, but you might not need to use it all. Just use enough so that everything comes together, because it can be really greasy if you use too much. Also, use gloves if you're going to mix this by hand, which I suggest you do, because the fat on your hands, it takes forever to get off. Use gloves. Then once everything is mixed, you can complete the process by sewing up the pemmican in a bag of undressed hide with the hairy side outwards. You don't have a bag of undressed hide, you say? Well, I suppose you can use a tin can, which was often used in the 19th century and then soldered shut, or for our purposes, I'm just putting it into a mold. I'm using a tiny 1-egg pan and a pinch bowl. You can even just form it up with your hands, just make it fairly compact, whatever shape you end up making it in, and then let it cool. And while it